The following is a presentation from the 8th Annual Humanities Days at Montgomery College. Together apart, creating spaces for understanding and reimagining society. Due to the 2020 pandemic, all presentations were conducted through Zoom. To learn more about Humanities Days at Montgomery College and to access other program recordings, please go to this website.
We're here today as part of Humanities Days. So Humanities Days is a series of events, and this is hard to believe this is the 8th year now that we've been doing this. But it was a series of events that was designed to bring attention to the humanities and to celebrate what we do in the humanities. And it's so important because science, technology, engineering, mathematics, STEM gets a lot of attention. Deservedly, yes, Cats of Ethics Week. But the humanities play such a vital role in our discourse and such a vital role in sort of the intellectual community that we try to form on college campuses, and the intellectual climate that exists in our society is informed by the study of the humanities. So one of the things that we've always done in the philosophy department is an ethics essay contest. And this year, the topic, and I should point out that Humanities Days, including the prizes for this event or for this contest, are co-sponsored by Global Humanities Institute, I want to say, and Paul Peck Humanities, as well as the Department of Humanities. So this year's ethics essay contest had a lot less structure than it had in previous years. In previous years, I had like a 2-page long prompt that indicated, spacing and, instructions on what to do, like in each paragraph of the paper sort of thing. So the kind of scaffolding that you would expect if you were taking a course and had been assigned a term paper. But this year, because I really wanted to solicit a wide variety of entries from people, including those who may not have studied philosophy or may not be studying philosophy right now, I made it as simple as possible. And the question was, are American colleges and universities the kinds of places that facilitate dialogue about the morally significant problems we face as a society? And if so, what makes it so? And if not, what could be changed to make that possible? And it's an interesting question because it's modeled after a much older question, a very famous ethics essay contest from the 18th century, put forth by the Academy of Dijon in 1749. The question was, has the restoration of the study of the arts and sciences led to a purification of morals? And you have to think that they had intended the answer to be yes. And this relatively unknown young essayist, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, responds, absolutely not. It's led to a further degradation of humankind. It's led us further away from our original human nature that's corrupted by society. And he won. And of course, he's been made very famous by subsequent works that he produced, including The Social Contract. And so what I thought would be interesting before we get to talk about our essays and before we announce the essay winner was to invite Professor Harding, Dr. Harding, from the Germantown campus, where he teaches philosophy and political science. And he will give a talk for us about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and in particular about the discourse on the arts and sciences, which was the work that emanated from his response to that ethics essay contest. So you too, this could be the beginning for you too, students who participated, of a long and productive, lucrative, and really magnificent philosophical career through having participated in this essay contest. But please, let's put our hands together and join me in welcoming Dr. Harding. Nobody has their mic on, so it's just me.
All right.
Welcome, Dr. Harding.
Thank you. This is an essay that I keep coming back to because even though Rousseau is writing this in 1750, it strikes me that he hits on things that are particularly relevant to us today. And really, ever that I teach this, I teach it every year. Every year that I teach this, I find more and more that Rousseau's concerns really are, or at least ought to be, our concerns. So there are a couple different ways that you can approach the essay. Superficially, it's about this difficulty of the restoration of the arts and sciences, or the Enlightenment, and the moral problem. The presupposition of the Enlightenment movement was that as you had advancement in the arts and sciences, you would also have advancement in or virtue. So the assumption that as we conquer the natural world, we're going to become more just. And Rousseau, he's the fly in the ointment here. He's writing at, peak Enlightenment, we might say, in France. Everyone had, or many people, at least many influential people, have this kind of faith. And Rousseau comes along and he says, no, this is going to be a disaster. The Enlightenment, modernity, it's going to be terrible.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why isn't Rousseau characterized as an anti-Enlightenment thinker, like Hamann, Herder, these folks?
Ultimately, I am inclined, how do I want to put this? Ultimately, he is not an anti-Enlightenment thinker because he is not a kind of he's not a rejecter of reason. He's not making that kind of turn to tradition that I would characterize as symptomatic of the anti-Enlightenment movement.
Tradition and the local versus the universal, that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and in particular because he's not condemning the Enlightenment outright. As we're going to see, part of what he's concerned with is the idea that our mania for universal education is, first of all, morally corrupting, right? It just makes people worse. Secondly, it makes it more difficult for people to pursue their own happiness. As he puts it at one point in the first discourse, a bad versifier or a subaltern geometer might have made an excellent cloth maker. And then thirdly, and this is, I think, the concern that should be resonant for us as well, he's concerned that as people become more accustomed to a kind of luxurious way of life, they're going to be much more easily tyrannized. As we start to confuse our wants with our needs, we're going to become much more easily tyrannized. So there's a footnote in the essay where he mentions the ichthyophagoi, which it's Greek, it just means fish eaters. And he says, when Alexander needed to bend them to his will, what did he do? He told them they can't fish anymore. In other words, he made them dependent on him. So one of the arguments that you start to see emerge in the course of the first discourse is the idea that as we become more advanced in the arts and sciences, as our wants kind of transform into needs, you're going to see the establishment of a kind of dependency.
So when we talk about this mania for universal education, we mean not necessarily, though we might also mean this, that everyone's learning the same thing, but we mean more so that everyone must be educated and that there ought not to be tradespeople in a sense.
Yeah, that is part of it. And part of Rousseau's objection to that is that it promotes a kind of, I guess we might say, a kind of cosmopolitanism. So this is why I'm hesitant on this anti-Enlightenment question, because he is interested in that kind of rootedness. If you look at the opening of the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, Rousseau gives you his, let's call it his teaching on the best regime, right? He gives you this long list of, if I could choose where to be born, it would be this kind of place, it would be that kind of place. And what he's describing is a kind of small republic where everybody knows each other. So there's a kind of surveillance of citizens by citizens for the sake of virtue. If you read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, you see something a little similar in Sparta. What happens there is the Spartans tend to be very, very virtuous when there are other Spartans around to watch them. And as we're going to see in a minute, Sparta is one of the exemplars for Rousseau. So what Rousseau wants to do is
that the book,
and that's the one you should, and that's the one people should buy too. It's great. It's got all kinds of good maps. The only problem is after careful study, it will fall apart and have to be taped together.
Yeah, I don't know why it's a paperback. Anyway.
So Rousseau claims that both the mind and the body have needs. And he says the needs of the body are the kind of ultimate foundation of society: food, clothing, shelter, and stuff like that. If you've read The Republic, the needs of the body correspond to what gets called the city of pigs in The Republic. The needs of the mind are the things that make society pleasant rather than merely serviceable. And they correspond to the relishes demanded by Glaucon in The Republic, or the requirements for commodious living that are introduced by Hobbes at the end of chapter 13 of the Leviathan. And what Rousseau wants to say is that the sciences and the arts are less despotic in their nature, but they're more powerful, which is to say that they have such a power over things that they don't need to rule us despotically. Government and law, he says, are more despotic, but less powerful. And they provide for the safety and security of human beings. And such security is ensured by restraining us from acting. So this consideration alone points us toward the kind of crucial difference between Rousseau's conception of the arts and sciences on the one hand, and the laws of a community on the other. The arts and sciences can seemingly rule more despotically than the laws of the community. The arts and sciences are capable of exerting a greater degree of control over us than government and law. And this is because insofar as the arts and sciences are productive of images and implements, right? In other words, art in the broad sense, and then technology, they are the means promoting a certain kind of moral understanding and a certain way of life. Now, government does this as well. Laws with teeth restrain us from wickedness because we're afraid of the consequences, right? So Rousseau's point is that the arts can shape the soul, which is not a new idea. Plato says the same thing. And the introduction of new technologies can alter the way of life. The founder of Sparta, a guy by the name of Lycurgus, understood this. Lycurgus creates a political education for the Spartans that leads to civic cohesion. No Spartan thinks himself to be superior to the city. So Lycurgus rules the passions of the people through this kind of Spartan education, which some of you may be familiar with. It's fairly brutal. The discipline that it engenders, and as I was saying a minute ago, the surveillance state. Lycurgus knew, as does Rousseau, that innovations in the arts and sciences are going to alter the way people live. Just think about the way the internet changed American society. So what does Lycurgus do? He limits technology to the necessary things. And in doing so, he limits both the desire to acquire for the Spartan people and the possibility of technological innovations. One of the things he does is he replaces gold and silver with iron coin, so that people who make their living by selling luxurious goods and luxurious items won't bother coming to Sparta. So all of this is helpful for understanding the kind of claim Rousseau is making. Technical innovations alter the way of life, and in altering the way of life, they alter the moral character of the people. And when you read the second discourse, he's going to bring up Lycurgus and Sparta as providing a kind of model for reforming society. But there's more. Rousseau says that human need, right, our needs raised thrones, and then that the sciences and the arts have strengthened them. So bodily need leads to the establishment of society and the requirement for government, while the sciences and arts, Rousseau wants to say, have strengthened those governments. This is because the sciences and arts can cover over the chains in which human beings live, Rousseau claims. So in other words, he's saying we come to love our slavery because the introduction of luxuries and entertainments that go hand in hand with the arts has the effect of making this slavery comfortable. The end result of this, Rousseau says, is that we have the appearance of all the virtues without the possession of any. In other words, we have good manners, but we're not actually good people. And then Rousseau says human nature hasn't actually changed. We're not any better than we were in the earlier stages of civilization. We're just better at hiding our badness. So it's not our that has changed, but our moral character. We're hiding our wickedness. And that's been brought about by the options in that the arts and sciences introduced. Rousseau is claiming that progress in the arts and sciences does not entail progress in morality, but rather it undermines moral virtue. The pursuit of the arts and sciences, he claims, it stems from a desire for distinction or honor and a rejection of equality. That desire and that rejection end up promoting as virtuous characteristics that don't do any good for the community. So Rousseau wants to say, in the best case, people like that are harmless, but in most cases, they're actually pernicious, and all the more so because of the invention of printing and what Nietzsche refers to as the mania for education. This is what allows what Rousseau describes as kind of the wicked doctrine of a Hobbes or a Spinoza to live on. So the proponents of universal enlightenment, Rousseau claims, are actually not promoting the improvement of humanity, but the degradation of humanity. And they're not promoting the freedom of humanity, but ultimately the slavery of humanity. Were they really and truly concerned with human virtue and human well-being, he says, they would promote a kind of salutary public teaching of civic virtue and duty aimed at shaping the soul so that your own private inclinations point toward the good of your community. All right, so the condemnation of the arts and sciences, I mean, that's kind of the condemnation in a nutshell. The condemnation of the arts and sciences presented in the first discourse, I think, ends up being both sincere and insincere. This is why I was a little, hedging my bets on your question earlier, Dan.
Well, but before you go on, we talk about this critique, and he talks about, the arts and the sciences not leading to a purification of morals, but actually just making us better at faking it, making us more polite, more civilized, but less good, right?
Yeah.
I can see the nature of entertainment is that way, right? Like sometimes when I see football games where there's, thousands of people in attendance, and I just think, well, what an incredible distraction from the real stuff of life, certainly sport can be a part of life, but anything that's a spectacle on that scale of that magnitude has to have as its goal exactly that, distraction, right? A way to pass the time, a way to remove oneself. So I see all of that, but tell me about Rousseau's thought that this entails a rejection of equality, or that the virtues that we celebrate when we celebrate the study of the arts and sciences really are non-egalitarian. How is that?
Well, look, Rousseau is kind of cagey on this. On the one hand, he's going to present himself as an egalitarian, but when you kind of press him on some of this stuff, he just sort of refuses to answer the question. So there's a passage in the second discourse, which I don't have handy at the moment. I think it's locked up in Germantown. There's a passage in the second discourse where he raises the possibility of a kind of natural inequality. And he just says, well, we're not going to talk about that. That's not a conversation that's really suitable. The difference, so what Rousseau is kind of aiming at, though, is that in the natural condition, or as close to our natural condition as we could come, there is a kind of elementary equality. But once we make that turn toward entertainment or spectacle, right? Once we make that turn toward trying to be pleasing to others, that's where you get inequality, or at least a kind of inequality. But it's more of a social inequality than a natural inequality. Natural inequality, as Rousseau understands it, would be things like strength, agility, stuff like that. Social inequality would be things like, I'm better at writing poetry than you. So when we get together under the tree at the end of the day, people listen to me and not you, and I get a kind of praise, and you start to feel bad about it. And that gives me some degree of influence in society. So that's the kind of thing that he has in mind by inequality. And that kind of inequality is promoted by society, right? So there's this passage in the first discourse where he comments, we no longer ask if a man is honest. We no longer ask if a man is virtuous. We ask, is he useful in some way, or is he entertaining, or things like that. Okay. So that's kind of what he has in mind.
Good, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. All right, so the condemnation of the arts and sciences that you get here in the first discourse, it's both sincere and insincere. It's not a simple condemnation, even though it might look like that, the first time you read it. Rousseau does think that they can undermine the sturdy Republican virtue that he prizes, but that's not the end of his view. So in addition to critiquing the arts and sciences, Rousseau is criticizing in a kind of oblique way a certain kind of regime. And this is indicated by his continual linkage of the sciences and the arts with regimes characterized by the rule of one. So if you go back and you look at the historical instances he gives you, he says Egypt is the mother of philosophy. Egypt is characterized by the rule of one man, the pharaoh. He claims that the fall of Greece to the Macedonian follows in part from the corruption of the arts and sciences, and that Rome too degenerates and becomes an empire because of the arts and sciences. So when you start chasing out the historical references, what you find is he's drawing a link between virtue and small republics on the one hand, and then vice and decay and moral corruption to regimes that are characterized by the rule of one. So the example of Rome is probably the most telling for our purposes. Rousseau notes that Rome, quote, finally falls under the yoke she had imposed on so many peoples on the evening of the day when a Roman citizen was named the arbiter of good taste. So Rousseau then is saying that the fall of Rome is not the point in 476 AD when the barbarian general Odoacer captures Rome, but instead it's the point where the poet Petronius is given the title elegante arbiter, the arbiter of good taste. Petronius lived in the 1st century AD. So what Rousseau identifies in a kind of guarded way as being the fall of Rome is not the point where Rome gets conquered by the barbarians. It's the point where Rome transitions from being a republic to being ruled by one man. So the fall of Rome involves not the enervation of civic virtue and conquest by the barbarian hordes, but the loss of republican virtue and the subsequent establishment of monarchical rule, right? He makes the same point when he talks about China. He says China is a society well advanced in the arts and sciences, where, as he puts it, honors and learning lead to the highest offices, but nonetheless, he says, it fell to the domination of the Tartar. So all of their learning, Rousseau suggests, had the effect of making them kind of weak and wicked, which is to say unfit to rule themselves, right? So Rousseau is hinting at the problem of luxury, even though he hasn't made it explicit yet. Cultivation of the arts and sciences requires leisure and promotes luxurious taste. People of luxurious taste are not people of simple taste. He wants to say they become slavish and wicked because their luxury makes them soft and weak. They are content to be in chains, provided their chains are covered with garlands and flowers, right? As long as their chains are comfortable, they're happy with it. The invading barbarians, he says, less refined than such men, seek to enslave them to a kind of brutal or hard despotism rather than a soft despotism, and they'll be unable to resist it because they lack the kind of republican virtues that would promote a vigorous defense of liberty, because they've been undermined by the arts and sciences. So Rousseau goes on to say it's not stupidity. When Rousseau says a people is stupid, that's almost a mark of praise. It's not stupidity, he says, that leads to the rejection of the arts and sciences by the early Persians, the Scythians, the Germans, and the early Romans, but it's actually prudence. And this is where he gives Lycurg Sparta special praise. He says that the turn to iron coin and the rejection of all but what is immediately useful serve to create a moral character and a regime that would prove to be enduring, as opposed to the Athenians, who he says provide models in all corrupt ages. And he cites Socrates as an authority in this regard, but if you've read the Apology, you might notice that he alters the passage. He wants to praise Socrates as having the ignorance of a kind of simple man, but Socrates doesn't have that ignorance. Socrates has what we might call a kind of learned ignorance, born out of an attempt to know the world around him and realizing how difficult that is. So as Rousseau notes, the Romans had been content to practice virtue. The Romans were happy to be virtuous, but everything was lost when they turned to the study of it. In other words, once the Romans turned to philosophy, they started arguing about virtue and stopped being virtuous. It sounds kind of weird to us, but there's something a little indecent about taking an ethics class. No offense, man.
Yeah, don't take it.
Right? Because what you're saying is that you don't know the truth about right and wrong, and it's open to question, right? Your society is supposed to tell you the truth about right and wrong. So Rousseau recognizes then what we might call the danger that philosophy holds. The philosopher can make a good city bad through questioning the salutary opinions that form the basis for civic virtue. But on the other hand, in a bad city, a bad regime, such destabilization of public opinion might actually make it better.
What's interesting is that I think that ethics professors in Rousseau's day, just as in Hume's day, were expected to be exemplars of the virtues that they taught about, right? That weren't just exploring, various theories of normative ethics and problems in meta-ethics, but they themselves were supposed to be a paragon of that which they taught. And of course, Hume, because in Scotland, even, leading up to the Scottish Enlightenment, the chair of philosophy was supposed to be someone who would be upholding Christian values and really committed to a specific Presbyterian view. Hume was ineligible for that post because he was an atheist.
Yeah.
Right. And so I wonder if Rousseau would have that same problem today.
Oh, Rousseau was kind of a dirtbag.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Well, didn't he die penniless, and he had he had children that he refused to care for and things like that.
Oh yeah, when they were born, he would just drop them off at the orphanage, is my understanding. The Confessions of Rousseau were kind of scandalous. I believe the book was publicly burned. He was chased out of France after they stoned the house he was living in. David Hume actually took him in, and then he became convinced that Hume was part of a plot against him.
Right. There's a great book by Edmonds called Rousseau's Dog.
Yeah, I haven't read that yet.
Between Rousseau.
I read his book on Wittgenstein and thought it was very good.
Yeah, Wittgenstein's Poker. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move on. So Rousseau begins the second part of the discourse by invoking the image that is printed in the frontispiece of the book. And the image is worth considering a little bit. It portrays a human being nude in the center. On his left is a satyr complete with pipes, and on his right is Prometheus holding a flaming brand, right? Prometheus steals fire from the gods, gives it to human beings. And Rousseau provides a commentary to the effect that the satyr wants to embrace the flame because of its beauty, but needs to be told that it's going to burn him. And Rousseau leaves it at that. But the account that he's referring to in Plutarch adds that fire will be beneficial for the one who knows how to use it. So there's a sense in which Rousseau is kind of deliberately distorting it. So it's in light of this distorted account that Rousseau provides that he makes the claim that human learning is not the result of our virtues, but our vices. And those vices, we want to recall, are not rooted in nature for Rousseau, but they're rooted in civilization itself, as the second discourse makes clear when Rousseau goes after Hobbes. So the real problem is the link of the arts and sciences with luxury and idleness. Rousseau says that those illustrious men who engage in the arts and sciences don't do any good for their own cities. The physical sciences, Rousseau wants to say, are ultimately of less importance than the moral sciences, but even the so-called moral sciences are themselves pernicious. There's a point where Nietzsche comments that he praises the dullness of moral philosophy because it keeps the many from recognizing just how questionable commitments might be. Rousseau wants to say that idleness in this scientific class of men would be, idleness would be contemptible, but even worse is the fact that they are not simply idle. Instead, they promote the results of their investigations, as he puts it, undermining faith and annihilating virtue. So this harmful activity, he says, it emerges out of a disdain for public opinion and a desire for self-aggrandizement through contrarianism. One of my favorite comments that Rousseau makes in this essay is he says, these enemies of religion, by which he means the Enlightenment philosophers and scientists, these enemies of religion would come willingly to the foot of the altar if only they lived among atheists. So his point is that it's not a sincere love of truth or wisdom that motivates them, but a desire for honor or distinction, right? So there's maybe an implicit comparison between the Socratic philosopher and the Enlightenment philosopher. The Socratic philosopher is motivated by a kind of erotic love of truth, but the Enlightenment philosopher is motivated by an erotic love of distinction or honor, the desire to be seen as preeminent and therefore as unequally gifted by nature, right? There's this desire for superiority. So these unequal gifts are employed in the pursuit of outward signs of inequality, and universal enlightenment is pursued precisely because it can't be universal, but it instead becomes the means by which this distinction is gained and recognized. Look at all the letters after my name. Aren't I better than you? Mm-hmm. So the motive force, Rousseau is saying, isn't philosophic eros, but vanity, which Rousseau claims in the second discourse inspires in men all the harm they do to one another and is the true source of honor. So these idle men, he says, they're not going to be recognized as higher or better than others if those others haven't been taught that their pursuits are valuable. But Rousseau's point is that they're not actually valuable, right? Understanding physics doesn't make you more just or more noble, he wants to say. Right? Unlike the pre-Socratic period, when moral and political commitments depended on a belief in the Olympian gods, the modern period has already severed morality from metaphysics or theology. And this is kind of the inevitable result of moves that you see in Machiavelli, in Descartes, and in Hobbes. Now, Rousseau recognizes that there's something, bad, something deleterious in this turn to the low as the source of the high. I think you've already covered Hobbes with them, right, Dan?
No, not yet. But what's interesting to me is that, Rousseau seems to celebrate this state of nature almost, right? Or the sort of connectedness that we have in the absence of society with something like virtue or morality, whereas Hobbes sees, the state of nature as providing the ground from which we create morality, create justice and injustice.
Well, so Rousseau's criticism of Hobbes is basically that Hobbes has the right methodology. Mm-hmm. Hobbes is right to try to go back to the state of nature, but Rousseau wants to say he hasn't actually done that. Mm-hmm. He wants to say that that Hobbes's state of nature is a war of all against all, because it's not actually the state of nature. It's a state of civil society. And this is in the second discourse. And the other argument he makes in the second discourse is that natural law teachings, whether you're talking about Hobbes or whether you're talking about someone like Aquinas, or even whether you're talking about somebody like Cicero, Rousseau wants to say that those teachings emerge because we have become bad people, and we need these teachings to try to talk ourselves into being good. So one of the things that characterizes modernity, you can see this in Machiavelli with his turn to self-interest. You can see this in Hobbes, where the fundamental passion is fear of violent death. Right. So one of the things that characterizes modernity is this kind of turn toward the low as being the source of the high. So Rousseau recognizes that there's something kind of bad in that. And in particular, he thinks there's something problematic about the emancipation of the acquisitive passions. Somebody like Locke is going to say that's actually good for a community. Rousseau thinks that that's actually bad, because such passions are inherently selfish and therefore inherently in tension with community. So Rousseau doesn't deny that such selfish passions can produce economic well-being. Instead, he denies that economic well-being is good for the community or for the individual. And again, the model here is Sparta, where the Spartan law was kind of deliberately crafted to keep Sparta itself relatively poor. So the crude pursuit of economic well-being, Rousseau thinks, can turn us away from the common good and toward one's own good. So the unleashing of the acquisitive passions, Rousseau thinks, doesn't do anything to overcome the the tension or the division between the individual and society. And then he says further that it's conducive to the establishment of what we might call an economy of luxury that both promotes further advances in the arts and sciences and undermines the kind of sturdy republican virtues of free peoples. So it's not learning that puts chains upon the freedom of human beings, Rousseau says, but the products of that learning. And in particular, the products that are suited to what Rousseau earlier in the essay calls the needs of the mind as opposed to the needs of the body. So the advances that allow for the satisfaction of bodily needs are one thing, but the advances that satisfy the needs of the mind, which are for Rousseau not strictly speaking natural, and therefore not strictly speaking needs, those are something else entirely. They are pleasant seductions, or as you put it a few minutes ago, Dan, spectacles that enervate the spirit and turn us away from the kind of sturdy republican virtue that is going to keep a jealous guard on our liberties, right? So it's this turn toward the needs of the alleged needs of the mind that foster dependency and hide the chains that bind us. A tyranny that allows us to live in comfort is easier to bear than a tyranny that oppresses us crudely. So the boot that stamps on the human face in Orwell's famous image is only necessary when a tyrant rules over a people whose thumatic or spirited character might lead them to resist. It's much better, Rousseau is realizing, to narcotize them with luxury and enervate their spirit than to beat them into submission and run the risk of engendering resistance rather than acquiescence. A gilded cage is still a cage, but if it's sufficiently gilded, nobody's going to care that it's a cage. So Rousseau, like his, let's say, his great disciple Alexis de Tocqueville, is less concerned with the kind of despotism that might evolve than he is with the fact of despotism at all. And then in addition to this kind of enervation of civic spirit, Rousseau worries about the domination of economism, let's call it, in the hearts of human beings. Luxury, he says, is both a sign of and a source of wealth. And he wants us to ask, what becomes of virtue when luxurious living is held in higher regard than virtue, right? He says the Sybarites were notoriously decadent, but it wasn't the decadent Sybarites who defeated the Persians. It was the Spartans. So Rousseau suggests that the Sybarites were ultimately subjugated by a handful of peasants. The Sybarite oligarchy was overthrown by a democratic revolution. So Rousseau's major point then is that the contemporary politician, right, and he's writing this in the 1750s, but I think this is probably very true today as well. The contemporary politician would rate the Sybarites as being more valuable than the Spartans because they spent more money than the Spartans did. The Spartans were very deliberately poor, while Rousseau is rating Sparta more highly than Sybaris because the Spartans possessed civic and military virtue enough to defend all of Greece from the Persian Empire. Rome also, he says, fell to barbarians who, like the Spartans, didn't know what wealth was. So this leads Rousseau to raise a question. Is it better for a regime to be brilliant and transitory or durable and virtuous? Strangely enough, he says brilliant, but the question he wants to raise is brilliant in what sense? Luxury, he says, prevents greatness. He says it's not possible that minds degraded by a multitude of futile concerns could ever rise to anything great. Right, again, if you're familiar with Plato's Republic, the image of education that you get in the cave involves a turning of the soul away from the constantly changing things of subjective experience and toward the permanent problems. Rousseau's making a similar point. A mind that's degraded by a bunch of futile concerns, spectacle, as you put it earlier, Dan, is never going to rise to anything great, right? If you can't turn off the TV or put down the phone, you're never going to achieve anything.
So what's interesting is that for Hobbes, of course, civilization provides not only the ground from which we can make claims about justice and injustice, but the sort of motive to defend those concepts, since without them, we don't have anything worth losing in a sense. And it's in part the material security provided by civilization that helps us create the institutions to defend that security and to resolve our disputes, and to adjudicate, contradictory claims to material prosperity. And Rousseau seems to see this as alienating, right? That it's taking us further away from something like moral perfection.
Yeah, and you'll see this. We think of Rousseau as a social contract theorist, but we don't always look that closely at what he has to say. One of the things you'll see in the discourse on the origins of inequality is he gives you a kind of lengthy hypothetical history of the human species, and at the point where he starts talking about a kind of Hobbesian or Lockean social contract, he says what we're really looking at there is, and you can hear echoes of this today. He says what you're really looking at there is not really something grounded in moral principle, as Locke claims, or grounded in enlightened self-interest on the part of everyone, as someone like Hobbes claims.
Right.
Rousseau wants to say that what you're really looking at is a kind of scam by the propertied class to create a society with laws that allows them to protect their own property.
Sure.
In other words, that inequality that emerges as a result of the turn away from natural goodness and cultivation of talents. Rousseau wants to say that the social contract is really just about making that inequality that is a result of the turn to a society that is concerned with talents permanent. And then the caveat I might add to that is that Rousseau, we'd have to think more in particular about how well Rousseau's critique applies to Locke, because he does have maybe a different reading of Locke than the traditional reading. And what I have in mind is there's a point in the second discourse, the discourse on the origins of inequality, where he suggests that Locke might even be a kind of crypto-teleologist. In other words, there might be a kind of crypto-Aristotelianism to Locke that Rousseau doesn't find in Hobbes, because Hobbes is kind of explicit about rejecting certain parts of Aristotelian physics, which would be necessary to support an Aristotelian conception of virtue and politics and things like that.
Okay. Rousseau said, the restoration of the study of arts and sciences have not led to a purification of morals. How do we explain the fact that the academic institution that he impugned celebrated his response?
Right. Well, I mean, one possibility is just the perversity of the novel, right? Rousseau is saying something new, and maybe they recognize, oh, well, this is new, this is shocking, so we're going to give it the prize. The other possibility is maybe the judges are persuaded, right? Maybe they're persuaded that Rousseau is right.
Right.
I don't know enough about who the judges
that they were eager to show that these Enlightenment institutions were so willing to challenge preconceived notions, including their own preconceived commitment to their correctness, right? Of their own approach. Yeah. They were sort of heralding this open-mindedness to the point that they were questioning even their open-mindedness.
Yeah, that may well be the case. And maybe they also recognized that whatever else is going on, Rousseau isn't attacking the arts and sciences simply. So I guess one of the reasons I keep coming back to this particular essay, and to Rousseau in general, is that Rousseau in this essay, the first discourse is a riddle to be solved. Does Rousseau attack reason simply? Does he attack the arts and sciences simply? And I'm inclined to say no. He's concerned with making at least two major points here. First, the restoration of the arts and sciences fosters a character conducive to despotic rule. And then secondly, he wants to kind of make a criticism of despotic rule itself. But the criticism of despotic rule can't be made openly. So what makes the first discourse such a kind of challenging work for us is that it is both what it seems to be on the surface, a criticism of the moral effects of the arts and sciences, and it's a kind of veiled attack on monarchy. And the closing of the essay, he kind of ends up saying advisors, he advises rulers on how to deal with the kinds of challenges that are going to be presented by the arts and sciences, since they can't be overcome or eliminated, right? We can't go back to the state of nature. The arts and sciences can't be put back into the box. They're going to have to be accepted as given and dealt with in those terms. So it's not going to be a question of eliminating them, but of moderating their effect. So at the end of the first discourse, he kind of gives this advice, he's telling monarchs, create learned societies that are going to promote civic virtue, things like this. There's a sense in which he's telling them to establish the conditions of their own overthrow. So there's a sense in which, insofar as this is a kind of argument for political leaders to take the danger presented by the arts and sciences seriously, his advice is essentially to tell the monarchs, what they need to do is they need to promote moral virtue. They need to promote civic virtue. In other words, the essay kind of indicates that if you wanted to be a tyrannical monarch, then you should take advantage of the arts and sciences, because Rousseau is saying these are things that make it really easy to be an absolute ruler in your society. And then he closes by telling political leaders, don't do that. In fact, you need to actively oppose the morally degenerating effects of the arts and sciences and of luxury. So in a way, he's telling, say, the French king, you need to essentially establish the moral conditions for your own overthrow.
So
right?
when we talk about luxury, we tend to think about that in purely material terms, right? That I've sold my soul, but for it I've gotten a nice car or a nice watch or something like that, right? But he means also a psychological wage, and that's why the arts and the sciences are implicated, right? Because they're making me more refined and they're honing my aesthetic sense, but I'm acquiring that aesthetic appreciation at the expense of something more meaningful.
Yeah, at the expense of something more meaningful, something more, ultimately for Rousseau, something more conducive to your own good and to the good of your community.
So when we talk about luxury in this sense, we're talking about ideology, and that if we become indoctrinated by organizations like institutions of higher learning, what we're doing is we're accepting a substitute for something that we ought not accept. This substitution, that all that glitters isn't gold, so to speak.
Yeah, that, but also you might be willing to put up with a lot more in terms of oppression if you've got a big screen TV with 800 channels, right? You might be willing to put up with a lot more that tends in the direction of tyranny from your government if that tyranny is going to be comfortable. And that's I think Rousseau's biggest concern is that the effect of the arts and sciences is that it's going to establish character in us.
It makes us obedient to the authority that will garland our chains.
Yeah, it makes us obedient, and it undermines that kind of classical Republican virtue. Right. I mean, that's his concern. And the secondary point, I think, would be that if you think about the contemporary situation, what you start to realize is that the role of technology in our lives can very much have this kind of effect on us.
Yeah, so what it makes me think of this recent book by a retired CIA analyst, Martin Gurry, who was inspired by Jose Ortega y and he wrote a book called Revolt of the Public. And his idea is basically that through challenging the ability of authority to control the narrative about their own failure, traditional systems, including faith and democracy, has started to break down because people continue to be dissatisfied, even though they possess many of the luxuries that Rousseau has described. And they don't have alternatives about what should replace democracy, but they do want to highlight failure and make it known that they're displeased.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the internet being one of those luxuries, it puts lots of things at our fingertips, but it also helps us to communicate as a society the reaches of our own disappointment.
Yeah, and I think maybe this is maybe the most profound issue. There are, and what I'm about to say, I don't know if Rousseau would necessarily agree with this.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain natural longings that human beings have. And I don't mean things like sex. I mean, there are certain natural longings for a kind of meaningful life, right? So you look at someone like Aristotle, part of the argument you're getting from Aristotle in the Nick Ethics is that reflection upon political life points to something, beyond the political. It points to the philosophical. So I think there is a sense that that modern regimes, I'm not speaking about the United States, but I think there is a sense that modern regimes in general, they provide this enormous physical well-being, right? I mean, I think about the way my grandparents lived. It's astonishing to me, and my grandparents, they were very poor immigrants, things like that, but it's astonishing to me, right? Compared to the kind of luxury that I live in. I think, I lived in Texas for a long time. I think about people living in Texas in the 1850s, and I can't imagine how they survived the summers there without air conditioning. But nonetheless, there is, I think, throughout the West, there is a kind of dissatisfaction, right? There is some kind of human longing, whether it's for what Aristotle wants to call the noble or the beautiful, whether it's for God or the gods, despite all of our, physical, external well-being. We're rich, we're healthy, we are the most miserable people in the world. You just look at, prescription rates for various psychoactive drugs, right? Psychopharmacology, right? We are a miserable society, and we need to, maybe think about why that is, because we do have a kind of prosperity that the world has never seen. I mean, we live in a country where poor people are fat. That's astonishing, right? If we don't think about it, but that's astonishing. We live in the midst of a kind of luxury that the world has never seen. We live better my little middle class life is vastly more luxurious than the life of a Roman emperor.
Sure, the famine is no longer, even though food insecurity is a real thing for the most part, yes, famine isn't the worry, but rather chronic obesity among
so we've got a society that gives us all of these great things, but we're still a profoundly unhappy people, in a way that we might not have been previously. And one of the things that Rousseau is kind of pointing to is the idea that maybe this economy of luxury isn't going to solve our problems. It's not going to make us virtuous, right? Maybe we need something beyond this economy of luxury if we're going to pursue some kind of human happiness, right? So you think about a guy like Aristotle. Aristotle wants to say that the key to human happiness is the cultivation of the virtues. But Aristotle bases this on a kind of analysis of species as being unchanging. So human nature doesn't change. Rousseau thinks it changes. Rousseau has the basic Darwinian insight about 100 years before Darwin. So so that ends up being the difficulty. Rousseau wants us to kind of make this return to a classical conception of virtue, but the science that made that classical conception of virtue isn't really possible anymore. And Rousseau is trying to kind of find our way back to that. In a similar way, somebody like Nietzsche is interested in doing the same thing. So I would almost go so far as to say it's starting with Rousseau is where you start to see the recognition that maybe modernity can't quite bring us the thing that it promises to bring us.
Right. And because the arts and the sciences are part of that promise, they're implicated.
Yeah. And if we really want to think about it, we might even go so far as to say that you could perhaps reconcile the two, but we'd have to think about how, right? So how can you have both virtue and, central air?
Right.
How do you reconcile?
And unlike the Spartans, right? Rousseau's point isn't that suffering makes you better, but rather that focus on luxuries, whether they be physical or psychological, distracts us from the difficulty of the task associated with the perfection of virtue.
Yeah, can you say that again?
Well, it's not so much a question. I just found it seems like a false evidence to say that because we're prescribed more prescription drugs now, that we're unhappier, because we may have we have no way of knowing how prevalent anxiety or depression were if we weren't diagnosing it. So I just think that I just found a little bit of a fault saying that, oh, we're so much unhappier now.
No, I mean, it's a broad generalization, but that's a fair criticism. I've got an old friend who ended up going into a monastery, and when he was in the process of formation, before he took his final vows, he was reading through the writings of various saints and important figures from the order he was joining. And he commented to me, reading it, he said, all these guys would just get kind of medicated today. So it's not that these things didn't exist, but we dealt with them, or human beings dealt with them in perhaps a different way.
Right.
You'd have to ask ourselves whether our way is superior. Maybe that's a better way to make the claim.
Sure, people have been unhappy for a long time, but it is also true that there's a point of diminishing returns when it comes to material prosperity. And this is something we discussed just recently in the context of Aristotle. When he writes in book 1 of the Nick Ethics, no one can be happy on the rack, right? He means that you need a bare minimum level of material wealth to live well, but beyond that bare minimum, you're not necessarily going to be proportionally better and better off. But other student questions or comments? Noah, you look like maybe there's something on your mind.
Well, I had a thought. I would argue that, it's a small point, but just because people are on antidepressants doesn't necessarily mean that they're unhappy. So, they could be working.
All right.
And it might be
Edward?
No, I just wanted to say thank you. I'm glad I wish I could turn off the recording while I talk, because it's going to be weird for me to listen to this again. But I recorded this. It's very informative. I honestly think I got the essay prompt wrong as soon as you started talking about Jacques and like what his standing is on education and like higher learning and arts and sciences. Like, I totally missed that one, but I don't think I spoke too much at length about that, so I don't feel too bad. But that was very enlightening. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, you didn't
thank you.
talk about that in your essay, so that's okay. It didn't have to directly address Rousseau.
I guess, maybe one more point to make about Rousseau on the question of higher learning. Part of his concern, and let me see if I can find the specific passage real quick. Part of his concern is that when you have these kinds of, as he calls them, the preceptors of the human race, by which he means people like, Descartes or Bacon or Galileo. Part of his concern is that when you put these guys, or people who are going to be of that stature, into these public institutions of learning, you're not actually helping them. You're kind of cutting them off at the knees. He thinks that you're actually, they don't need, let me see if I can find the passage, right? They don't need to be kind of publicly educated. They've got a kind of natural insight. Yeah, so this is, well, I've got a different translation than you in front of me. Is this the passage I'm looking for here? Yeah, so he says, those whom nature destined to be her disciples, right? The truly great geniuses of the natural sciences. Those who nature destined to be her disciples need no teachers. Verulam, who's Bacon, Francis Bacon, Descartes, Newton, these preceptors of the human race had none themselves. Indeed, what guides would have led them as far as their vast genius carried them? Ordinary teachers, you and me, would only have restricted their understanding by confining it within the narrow capacity of their own. The first obstacle, and then he goes on to explain how they kind of become what they are, right? So that's the other concern he has with kind of mass education, is that when you do get these kind of extremely gifted minds like Bacon or Descartes, and you send them to school, you're just gonna break them.
There's a question from Greg. Could Rousseau have known anything enough about science as we know it today to have anything to say about it that is relevant to us today? And I'm guessing the answer is yes, in the sense that although the content and the methods of science have changed dramatically in the last 250 years, we still use science to serve our needs and create more luxury, right? I mean, we also use it in pursuit of truth, whether or not we can use it. And, as an example of that, I think about the Large Hadron Collider in Europe, right, where they're banging particles together to discover the Higgs boson and things like that.
I think Rousseau, his critique of science is basically, I think, something like this. It's able to discover truths about the material world, but those truths about the material world don't translate into anything meaningful about the moral world, right? 20th century physics can tell you how to build an atomic weapon, but it can't give you any guidance as physics as to whether or not you should. And if you do build it, it can't give you any guidance as to under what circumstances it would be morally permissible to deploy it. So that's really a good illustration, I think, of Rousseau's concern. Rousseau's concern is that the Enlightenment claims that with that advancement in knowledge of the physical world, you're going to have an improvement in morality. And he wants to say, well, not only you're not going to get that, it's actually going to be made worse. But his basic objection to the sciences, even a few hundred years later, it's still going to be something like this. Knowing the atomic weight of cobalt doesn't make you more just or more noble. And Rousseau wants to say that's actually, that's kind of less important, right? So the problem he would have with the contemporary understanding is we've kind of raised the scientist to the level of being the arbiter of things that Rousseau thinks the scientist can't be the arbiter of, right? So science as physical science, Rousseau's going to say, well, by definition, it's going to have nothing to say about virtue. It's going to have nothing to say about justice, which means it's going to have nothing to say about the ingredients of human happiness.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Olivia?
I just had, I'm sorry, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't read the whole essay, but from what I'm hearing today, kind of how he was asking what's relative, like what's relevant for us today. I found it interesting. Would you think it would be relevant to calls for like justice in this, and like social justice in the world, where, because I feel like the idea of luxury kind of corrupting is like how I feel like it was interpreted. Like the feeling of like, say, being a privileged person. There's a common thing that goes around, like quote that goes around saying like, when you're used to being privileged, like equality feels like oppression. In that kind of regard, where it's not necessarily that we are made, not only would the progress of the arts and sciences and being having luxury, not only does it make us more easily tyrannized, but also makes equality in general harder. That there's a thought there.
Yeah, and actually there's, this is maybe kind of funny as a guy who's devoted his life to philosophy. There's this wonderful passage where Rousseau attacks philosophy in the second discourse, the discourse on the origins of inequality. And he says, one of the things that philosophy does, or that education perhaps more broadly does, he says, it kind of blinds you to the sufferings of others. And the example he gives is, he says, the philosopher could hear somebody being murdered outside his window at night, and all he has to do is stick his fingers in his ears and argue with himself a little bit to go back to sleep, right? He can kind of talk himself into just not caring, because it's just one person, and his concern is what's going to convulse the whole society, and things like this. Whereas he wants to say that the less educated person, right? And the example he gives in the second discourse is the people who would just work in the public markets. He says, when they perceive an injustice, they don't think about it, they rush to correct it. So, he's again trying to suggest that one of the effects of education is that it does have this kind of morally deleterious effect on us. And whenever I teach this stuff, one of the examples that always comes to my mind that some of you guys might remember, this happened, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago. There was a stabbing on the Red Line train in DC on July 4th. One guy stabbing another guy, and there's like 7 or 8 other people on the train, and they're just tweeting about it. Nobody steps up to try to save this man's life. They just get on Twitter and talk about it. And that's kind of what Rousseau was saying. He's saying that's what education does to you. You don't want to get involved because maybe your nice Burberry coat's going to get cut. Whereas the person who hasn't been, in Rousseau's mind, corrupted by education is going to immediately perceive, here's an injustice, I need to go do something about it. Is that a good answer, Olivia?
Yeah.
So, Dr. Harding, thank you so much. We're almost out of time, and I know that some of my students have to leave for other classes, and I know that there's another event coming up at 12:30. So what I'd like to do is announce the ethics essay contest winner, and then invite whoever wants to hang out for a couple of minutes to discuss your entries, but then to let go everyone who needs to go at 12:15. So I don't know how we give applause, via Zoom, but thank you, Dr. Harding, for the great presentation that you've given us today.
Well, thank you. You're welcome. I like Rousseau. I like talking about Rousseau. I also dislike Rousseau in certain ways, but he's one of those people I keep wrestling with. So I'm always happy to have the chance to talk about him, think it through again.
Yeah, no, that was great. That was great. Now, and of course, Dr. Harding also helped to judge the ethics essay contest entries, which need not, as Edward, need not have mentioned Rousseau at all. So it's okay if you omitted Rousseau, or even if you got him wrong in some minor respect, if you chose to mention him. Really, it was wide open for you to give whatever kind of answer that you wanted. And just as Rousseau's answer to the question was subversive, you might have given a subversive answer and said, I think that higher ed is not very good at promoting dialogue about morally significant issues, and such an essay could have won. In the end, we got about 15 entries, and it was about 70 pages in total. So it was a lot of reading, and there was a lot to like. And it was difficult to select just one from among all of these, because there's so many good things that could be said about all of them. But the winner, as I'd like to announce, is, I think, actually not here today. The winner, I think, could not actually attend today because they had a class at this time, but the winner is Natalie Hoffman. So if you know Natalie, congratulate Natalie Hoffman. But there were, as I say, lots of great essays, including essays from our class. And again, lots of good things to talk about, but among those that stuck out for me were Zin's. Zin, are you here?
Hi.
So did you enjoy writing your essays, Zin?
I absolutely did.
So,
Hi, Professor Greg.
so what did you say? What was your answer to the questions, Zin?
It is, I didn't really mention Rousseau at all. I thought that we don't really have, freedom to speak, and there are a couple of problems. I mentioned it as a thesis.
So you feel that we don't really have freedom to speak about morally significant issues in higher education?
Sometimes not absolute freedom, because some speakers are counseled or called out in some instances.
Okay.
Yeah, if they are controversial speaker or provocative speakers.
Okay. So right. So there are controversies, and there are questions about who may speak and what counts as a message worth sharing in this venue, right?
Yes.
And so what suggestions did you make, if you made any, about how to address that?
In my thesis I mentioned that if we want to see colleges and university as an environment where everybody can express honestly, we need to safeguard freedom of speech, and we have to tolerate criticism to ideas, and we have to appeal to facts.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that we're good at tolerating criticism? I mean, one of the things that we do in philosophy, as you noticed, and especially in ethics, is we look at a theory and we look at what's good about it, and we give it as charitable a reading as we can, but then we really subject it to intense scrutiny and rake it over the coals and see where it fails and see where it's sloppy. And I think that this builds up both our capacity to engage in that kind of evaluation, but also increases our expectation that our own beliefs have to survive those kinds of tests. But I mean, do you think that we in our society are good at that? Are we good at withstanding criticism, or do we either kind of wither in the face of it or simply respond to it militantly and kind of not engage? I mean, sometimes, a student was telling me the other day, they've stopped watching the news because when they watch it, it's just like people screaming at each other. And that's the opposite of discussion, right? That's the opposite of dialogue. And so built into this question is higher ed a place where we can discuss morally significant issues? That entails more than just providing an opportunity for people to express their opinion, but requires us to create a milieu where they can interact with each other and actually listen to each other and be influenced by one another, right? And that's something that we can contribute to making happen, right?
Yes.
And Olivia, you said something like this too, right? That it can be, this kind of dialogue can be fostered.
Yeah, I kind of wrote that it's kind of no, unless there's certain conditions are met.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like I've had certainly very good conversations in college classrooms. I've also had terrible conversations in classrooms. Even this semester I've had with discussions of say racial justice, a professor railroading a conversation, or not equally distributing. So if unless there's very specific things met.
It's hard to have sensitive conversations well. I mean, so much has to be built into it. And Edward, in your response too, you said something about this Aristotelian conception of virtue, you talked about eudaimonia.
I did what I could.
And, I think that institutions probably can't flourish in the way that Aristotle has in mind when he talks about eudaimonia, but individuals that participate in those institutions certainly can.
Yeah, I kind of like veered off the topic and just kind of went on like a rage rampage. I kind of just see universities as businesses, and like they're institutions where good things can of course happen, but at their core, they're making money and they're here to promote their own interests. So
there was another really great entry too that talks about that, the sort of like kind of a corporatization effect in higher ed that could be troubling. And that's a student who also I think is not here, but I want to congratulate everyone who participated in the ethics essay contest. I think it's
way to go, Zen. I'm sure it was good.
And there was a lot to like in everybody's, and I think it's great to participate in an ethics essay contest. It gets you writing, it gets you thinking, and I hope it leaves you with the impression that what you write matters, A, and B can be very powerful. So is worth doing. So give yourselves a round of applause. Well, that's it. Hey, we're out of time, everybody. Thank you again. Great to see everybody. I'll hang out if you have any questions. Otherwise, you're free to go. And if you're in my class, I'll see you Tuesday.